Thank you, Professor Sana, for this kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, first I would like to thank Director Haneda for the honor of inviting me to give a lecture here at Tokyo College, this innovative institute at the University of Tokyo. Although the concept of revolution is most often associated with political upheaval, it can also be applied to all manners of situations involving radical change. During the past 50 years or so, the term has come to be associated with Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolution in 1962. While Kuhn's term paradigm shift has been widely disseminated and applied to the most diverse of areas, the term has taken on a more ambivalent usage with respect to changes of knowledge in the natural sciences. There is a fundamental difference in how the term is used by historians of science on the one hand, and by natural scientists on the other hand. When natural scientists talk about revolution, it often has a more general meaning, such as to refer to comprehensive and groundbreaking discoveries or new terminology, explanations, and methods. The said revolution is thus a subjective assessment along an undefined scale spectrum without lacking distinct criteria as to where the boundaries lie for what is or is not to be regarded as a scientific revolution. In other words, this is a question of preference. And this is something that becomes quite clear when considering which Nobel Prizes can be said to have been awarded for scientific revolutions. There seems to be a general consensus that the Nobel Prizes awarded to the theory of quantum mechanics and discovery of the molecular structure of DNA can indeed be regarded as scientific revolutions. Otherwise, however, there is a great deal of disagreement. Perspectives largely seem to differ depending on the disciplines people represent. In fact, there seems to be two categories of Nobel Prizes that have been called scientific revolutions. I refer to them as internal and external Nobel Prizes. Internal Nobel Prizes have rewarded discoveries that represented a revolution for a particular scientific discipline. External Nobel Prizes have rewarded discoveries whose practical implementation has represented a revolution for many individuals, or, as Alfred Nobel put it, have conferred the greatest benefit on mankind. The dream, no belief, is that even the internal Nobel Prizes will, in time, have the same positive impact on humanity. Hence, the journalists' simplistic questions after the announcements in October each year. They hope that even the most esoteric discoveries concerning the inner structure of matter and the dark history of the universe will eventually, so to speak, one day enable us to make better brake pads for our cars. That research, that a deeper understanding of nature and the universe should have a value in itself is rarely mentioned. No, that basic research is an essential part of our culture is an idea which has few followers in our greedy, materialistic times. This external division of the Nobel Prizes may seem arbitrary, but perhaps it captures attention in the title, The Nobel Prize and the Concept of Revolution. Here are some examples. Internal, quantum mechanics, Nobel Prize 1918 to Planck, Heisenberg 32, Schrödinger and Dirac 33. Molecular structure, DNA, Watson, Crick and Wilkins 62, and others. External, medical diagnosis, Röntgen 1901, Cormack and Hounsfield 79, Lauterbur and Mansfield 2003, artificial fertilizers, Fritz Haber 1918, penicillin, Fleming and others in 1945, polio vaccine, thanks to Enders, Robbins and Weller 54, the transistor, Shockley, Bardeen and Brattain 56, and more. The underlying assumption is that there is a progressive development towards greater understanding of the physical world, a development that occasionally undergoes major progress through revolutions. This is the view of scientific progress and development that natural scientists themselves promote, as do science journalists, science museums, science centers, and indeed anyone trying to explain and popularize the natural sciences. Let us now consider how the term revolution is used by those who study the development of scientific knowledge. We, the historians of science. Well, in fact, we do not use it at all. This may seem strange, since Thomas Kuhn's book was originally published for and discussed extensively by historians of science. It was here that the book enjoyed its first major breakthrough, and it is by no means an exaggeration to say that it influenced a whole generation of historians of science back then. One consequence of Kuhn's book and the subsequent debate it sparked for the history of science as a discipline was to focus the attention on the social prerequisites for and the inner workings of the development of scientific knowledge. It formed the point of departure from which the academic discipline of the history of science developed over the last 50 years or so, with its focus on detailed case studies. This has meant that a more grandiose synthetic theory, such as Thomas Kuhn's, with its claim of general relevance, now appears to be highly exaggerated and outdated. Rather, in the same way that general historians have long since come to regard Arnold Toynbee and his meta-history on the rise and fall of civilizations. There is a contradiction here. On the one hand, there is the given way in which natural scientists or the scientific community at large toss around the term revolution, and on the other hand, the way professionals in the history of science avoid it. With one foot in each camp, so to speak, this has created a dilemma for me, since I'm trained both as a physicist and a historian. I have long felt a distance to both sociologists of science, with a militant need for micro-studies, and to the natural scientists with a sometimes somewhat simplistic view of their own activities. I'm now going to attempt to translate this personal issue, which may appear to be some sort of a personal vendetta waged against both sides or neither of them, into something that may be of more general interest. During the last few decades, I have in fact been living in a kind of no man's land with regard to the history of science, located as it is between two categorically different perceptions of what scientific knowledge is and how it is formed. That said, no man's land a term from the First World War used to describe the area between the trench lines, may be incorrect, as it suggests two opposing sides that are constantly attacking each other. In the present case, however, they barely take any notice of each other at all. Sociologists of science criticize natural scientists for their naive and positivist view of their own work, as they see it, while natural scientists simply shake their heads and find the sociologists of science entirely preposterous, rather daft, in fact. That is, of course, if they take any notice of the criticism being voiced by the sociologists of science at all. Indeed, it might be better to say that the two groups are living in parallel universe, yet coexisting in some odd way in the Gutenberg galaxy. Sociologists of science publish articles in their own journals, such as the Social Studies of Science, as well as monographs with highly regarded academic publishers. Meanwhile, natural scientists publish articles in journals such as Nature, Science, and numerous other highly specialized periodicals. The publishing industry serves both sides without much thought, rather like a cynical arms dealer. The difference, however, is that in this case, the two sides are not exchanging fire. Instead, they are simply tending to their own gardens. Regardless of the metaphors, be they no man's land, parallel universes, or different gardens, there has been no place for me on either side. My interest in the Annales School, Marc Bloch, Fernand Braudel, and their long perspectives is now out of step with the times in most people's eyes. This may be the case for general historians, but I would like to put forward the idea that historians of science, whose subject was not established as an academic discipline until the dominance of the Annales School had subsided, have been far too quick to adopt new terms and theoretical approaches without first having fully explored the consequences of what previous generations of historians may have contributed to their own discipline. I shall attempt to describe the difference between each side's perceptions of how scientific knowledge developed. Natural scientists on the one hand, and historians of science on the other hand, by yet another metaphor, the construction of the Gothic cathedrals. From about 1150 to 1430 AD, several hundred cathedrals were built across Europe. The most well-known in France include Saint-Denis, Notre-Dame, Chartres, Amiens, and Reims. In Spain, we have Santiago de Compostela, Burgos, Malaga, Toledo, and Seville. In Germany, Cologne, Regensburg, and Ulm. In England, Winchester, Lincoln, Salisbury, Worcester, York, and Canterbury. And in Italy, Milano, and all the rest. These cathedrals had huge naves with high ceilings, and architects pursued ever greater volume and ceiling heights to manifest and honor God's greatness. The supporting pillars were made as narrow as possible so that the wall surfaces could accommodate large stained glass windows. The sunlight shone through these colorful windows, lit up the cathedrals, and served as a symbol of God. The cathedrals were also adorned with soaring spires that stretched up to the heaven, representing man's longing for another, better life beyond this earthly existence. A special building technique that characterized these Gothic cathedrals was developed to create vast and voluminous spaces with minimal wall surfaces supporting tall spires. This included rib vaults, pointed arches, and outside pillars and buttresses that supported the weight of the walls and eliminated the need for thick walls. Today, the cathedrals present an image of enduring stability, but their construction and the development of the building techniques was largely done by trial and error. We know that the walls and ceilings of several cathedrals collapsed while they were being built, and that several spires came crushing down. During the last 30 years or so, social constructivists have largely dictated the history of science, known as the social construction of science. In terms of the Gothic cathedral metaphor, it is as though they are not interested in the construction and growth of this large edifice. Indeed, they go so far as to doubt its very existence. Rather, they are interested in the individual building blocks, the carefully cut pieces of sandstone or limestone. They have questioned their smooth surfaces and seemingly solid appearances. By cracking them open, or as they say, opening the black box, so to speak, they are showing how these have been shaped by conflicting interaction between science and society, by competing interests. Not until these controversies have been resolved, a settlement having been agreed by two opposing views, will a consensus be reached and the black box be closed to reach closure. Using the cathedral metaphor, this would involve the blocks of stone regaining their smooth exterior to imply a solid and harmonious core. But this is only seemingly so. The block of stone is the result of a disagreement that was eventually resolved in a particular social context and during a particular time. And it is upon these seemingly solid yet fragile blocks that scientific knowledge is built. However, as already mentioned, social constructivists have not shown much interest in the large construction. Their main focus has been on micro-studies on isolated periods of time. They had never had any interest in the long time periods or perspectives. These stone blocks build a whole cathedral. Such a beautiful sequence of images. I'll take it again. Okay. Natural scientists, on the other hand, regard the development of scientific knowledge as a construction of a colossal cathedral, thus creating a lasting edifice block by block. A revolution would mean that part of the existing construction was incorrect, meaning that it would have to be pulled down and replaced by new parts, assembled using a new method that better satisfies the technical demands for a sustainable construction. A vault in one of the side aisles have proven to be fragile. It is no longer supported by its buttresses and has instead begun to crumble. The sandstone block becomes dislodged, falls to the ground, and cracks. It becomes increasingly evident that the construction is flawed and must be replaced by a construction built using completely different principles. A young master builder on the other side of the Alps suggests a new method. At first, this young upstart, is met by distrust and mockery. But his construction appears to hold up, and whatever previous generations have worked so hard to erect is simply pulled down to make way for something new, perhaps in the face of protest from certain individuals. This demolition or deconstruction is to make way for something new. And then the construction process simply proceeds based on the new principle, or the new principles, block after block, as this seems sustainable, a period of what Thomas Kuhn called normal science. The Nobel Prizes have given a seal of approval, a summa cum laude, to the last 100 years of development. Not that there is anything intrinsically wrong with this, but the Nobel Prizes have also suggested that these discoveries or inventions are not only set in stone, smooth and everlasting blocks of stone, but also that they have been placed on top of each other to create a stable construction in the cathedral of scientific knowledge. Indeed, the problem may not be the Nobel Prize as such, but rather the fact that they have only existed for a relatively short period of time. In other words, the problem is that human lifespans are so short. Had it been the life expectancy of human beings, I mean, it's slightly longer here in Japan than in my own country, Sweden, but approximately the same, okay? But had it been, say, 5 times longer, an individual would have been able to review 400 years of scientific development during his or her lifetime. From the early 1600s to today, that is, from the beginning of what is generally called the scientific revolution. Just imagine, as a thought experiment, that the Nobel Prizes had been established around about the year 1600 as a secular equivalent to, for example, the Pontifical Academy of Sciences in Rome, the Pope's Academy in Rome. If average human life expectancy was 5 times longer, it would have enabled people to experience considerable changes of paradigm shifts in scientific knowledge. Discoveries would have been rewarded and marked with an aura of eternal truth, only to later crumble and fall down. For had this been true, a single human life would have witnessed all matters of discoveries, as for example the following. In the study of matter, the physical world, the teachings about the 4 elements, earth, water, air, and fire, were replaced by elementary theory and later atomic theory. These were later radically changed by quantum physics, particle physics, the standard model, string theory, the theory of everything, etc. In biology, the first book of Moses in the Bible of the Occidental world had to give way to the ideas of Lamarck, Darwin, and Mendel. These were followed by variants including racial biology and Lysenkoism, and their rise and fall, and today by DNA and genomics. In cosmology, the geocentric model put forward by Aristotle and Ptolemy was replaced by Copernicus' heliocentric model. Then followed a number of opposing theories about the origin of the universe, including the steady-state theory and matter and antimatter theory, and these were eventually defeated by the Big Bang theory, which is the reigning theory for now at least. In medicine, The influence of humoralism or Galenic anatomy gradually declined. This theory holding that health came from the balance between 4 bodily liquids: black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. This was the theory that lived until the 1850s. The work of Vesalius and Harvey led to revolutionary changes in anatomy and medicine. Surgery had long been pretty advanced in terms of the techniques and instruments used, but it became less lethal, less deadly, thanks to the introduction of antiseptics. In fact, skillful surgeons could since long perform technically perfect operations, but before the late 19th century, the patient rarely lived to enjoy the result. Yes, mortality decreased through the development of vaccine and insights gained from the discovery of microbes and cells. The most recent century also saw the discoveries of penicillin, antibiotics, and polio vaccine, which can indeed be regarded as revolutionary considering the amount of human suffering that these have been spared. Perhaps contraceptives, psychiatric medication, and gene therapy will also come to be seen as revolutions in the future. Well, these are just a few of the amazing discoveries that a person with a lifespan of 400 years would have lived through. To see this idea come and see them go. And indeed, I imagine that such a person might be more modest with regard to their faith in current scientific knowledge as being eternally true, and less ridiculing of any previous ideas and beliefs. Now, let me tell you a story. The Swedish scientist Morten Trivald was one of the founders of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences in 1739. He was later to become elected a foreign member of the Royal Society of London, and he was to have several of his articles published in the Philosophical Transactions. After spending 10 years of his youth in England, he returned to Sweden in 1726, brimming with excitement over everything he had learned and eager to share it with his countrymen. In 1728, he gave a series of public lectures at Riddarhuset, the Swedish house of nobility. He spoke about Newton's laws of motion and the new experimental physics. And these lectures he later published in 2 heavy volumes, illustrated with a large number of engravings. Some years ago, I gave a lecture on Morten Trivald and his lectures. I gave a lecture on him and his lectures to the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences at Riddarhuset, in the very same room where Trivald had spoken more than 250 years ago. These rooms here. That was really a kick for a historian to do that. Talk about his lectures in the same room where he gave his lectures 250 years earlier. But not only that, I had ordered a reconstruction, an exact replica of a scientific instrument Trivald used for one of his experiments. This was an electrical friction machine to demonstrate the corpuscular nature of electricity. The corpuscular nature of electricity. When you hold the skin of a cat against the rotating glass globe, it becomes electrically charged, and the tiny woolen threads inside the glass globe stand to end like spokes on a wheel. So, and inside here, tiny woolen threads, okay? They stand on end like spokes on a wheel. If you put your finger against the glass globe, as if to touch one of the threads within it, the thread collapses, and if you remove your finger, it points outwards again. Trivald explained that this proved that there were subtle materials, particles, that go through the pores of the glass despite the tight or dense appearance of the glass. He said, "Should anyone call into question that a subtle material were not to penetrate the glass, I would at once show said person that I could touch whichever of the woolen threads I prefer, the ones inside the glass globe, in spite of the glass being in the way." The moment the machine is kept still and the globe ceases to rotate, the thread at which I point would retreat, only to leap back into position as soon as I remove my finger. However else might this be possible, other than the fact that in this way the subtle matter that comes from the glass bounces towards my finger and back through the glass to return the string back to its original order. This was a logical explanation in accordance with the prevailing perception about electricity as small particles or corpuscles. And it was an explanation in accordance with the paradigm within which Trivald and his contemporaries worked. After my lecture, I was approached by one of the members of the Academy, an old friend of mine who also happened to be a member of the Nobel Committee for Physics. He was roaring with laughter and thanking me for this wonderful entertainment that I had provided. "My goodness, weren't they stupid?" he said. "What crazy ideas they had." I didn't reply. I just thought to myself that I wished that he would live another 200 or 300 years or so to see all those fabulous peer-reviewed articles published in scientific journals, of which he and his colleagues were so proud, be crushed and overrolled and give way to some new stone block pieced together with new ideas and principles that we cannot imagine today. So my belief is thus that the Nobel Prizes have influenced and perhaps even distorted our view of scientific development, since the time perspective is so short. The Nobel Prizes have only been around for just over 100 years, and the prizes that have been awarded during this time have not simply rewarded remarkable efforts of their times, but they have also implied that these discoveries have an eternal and unchangeable durability. So, the problem is not the existence of the Nobel Prizes per se, but rather the fact that they have been around for a relatively short time, and that human life spans are so short. If people lived longer, it would be easier to see that the scientific cathedral is in fact a rather unstable construction, constantly under reconstruction. Some parts, some structures stand the test of time, whereas others crumble to the ground and have to be rebuilt according to new principles. Those who visit the scientific cathedral as tourists or a worshipper will at first only see an impressive and seemingly solid building. But viewed with temporal distance, say 2 or 3 centuries, we would see foundations shaking, buttresses moving, walls crumbling and spires tumbling before being rebuilt on new foundations based on new principles and beliefs. This cathedral is in a state of constant change, never quite reaching completion, like an over everlasting building site. Finally, the Gothic cathedrals are rather a poor metaphor for the scientific endeavor, because they are still standing, unmowed, unchanged, and unfaltering, as they have been for hundreds of years. Well. I had written this much, and here my lecture today was supposed to end. I had been invited in the middle of March by Professor Haneda to give a talk here at Tokyo College, and I sent the title of my talk to Tokyo College in late March, The Gothic Cathedral of Science. Then, only a few weeks later, the strangest of things happened. On April 15, Notre Dame in Paris, perhaps not the most beautiful, but certainly the most well-known of the hundreds of cathedrals still standing today, was severely damaged by fire. The roof collapsed, and finally the spire crumbled. The roof and the spire will need to be rebuilt, and heated discussions are already taking place regarding the principles for this reconstruction. What materials, what methods, and so on. Then, in the same week, in early April, another remarkable thing happened. At a number of press conferences given simultaneously at several places around the world, scientists described how they had succeeded in producing and generating the first image of a black hole. The coincidence that these two events took place in the same week in early April, the damage to Notre Dame and the publication of the image of the black hole, led me to the following thought: can this new knowledge of the universe, the image of the black hole, be compared to the damage of Notre Dame? That is, that these astrophysical discoveries may force scientists to reconsider our knowledge of the universe and the structure of matter, that they, so to say, may need to reconstruct and rebuild parts of the Gothic Cathedral of Science. Thank you very much.